Hey there, folks. I'm not sure where to start with this. It's a little hard to even get the words out, but I guess I'll just tell it as it happened. I mean, it's not the kind of thing you forget easily, right? I got this email last week, and at first, I thought it was just one of those spooky stories. You know, the kind tales passed around like campfire gossip, with a twist at the end meant to leave you shivering for a bit. But, as you'll see, this wasn't one of those. It came from someone who didn't even leave their name. The subject line was simple: creepy things that happen in the country at night. At first, I didn't think much of it. I'm always getting messages from listeners, so I just clicked open, ready to read something that might make for a good episode. But what I found inside, well, let me tell you, it wasn't something I was ready for. Here's what they wrote. I don't know who to talk to about this, but I think you might understand. It started one night when I was alone at the house. The kind of night where it feels like the whole world just holds its breath and you can't even tell where the wind's coming from. I live out in the country, so when it gets dark, it gets dark. No streetlights, no city glow, just the kind of dark that feels like it's swallowing everything whole. I was sitting at the kitchen table reading a book. I know, a strange place to sit, but I like the quiet in there. The only light was from the lamp above, the hum of it almost too loud in the silence. My cat was on the windowsill, her eyes glowing in the dim light as she stared out into the blackness. That's when I heard it, something, or someone, moving around outside. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. We get a lot of those around here, but then I heard footsteps. Not the kind of soft, scurrying steps you'd expect from a small animal. No, these were heavy, like boots on dirt. I froze, just listening, wondering if maybe it was my neighbor or someone lost, but that didn't make sense. There's no one else around for miles. I got up, walked over to the window, and pulled back the curtain just a little. I could see nothing but the trees out in the distance. It was so still, so unnervingly still, that I thought maybe I'd imagined it. Then I saw it. A figure standing right at the edge of the woods, just outside the range of the porch light. I couldn't make out any details, but I could see the outline. And it didn't move. Just stood there, watching. I didn't know what to do. My heart started pounding, and I backed away from the window, grabbed my phone, and called my friend across town. No answer. I dialed again. Nothing. I'm telling you, that figure stayed there the whole night. I'm not sure how long it was, but when the sun came up, it was gone. No trace, nothing. I don't know what was out there, but I haven't been able to sleep right since. I thought I'd send this to you, because I know you've got experience with strange things happening in places like mine. Please, tell me this isn't something I imagined. As I sat there, staring at the screen, something in the back of my mind clicked. It was like hearing a story I'd known before, one I had heard from my own family, in hushed tones. They'd warned me about things like this, things that happened out here in the dark. It's funny, isn't it? How we can live with something our whole lives, and then one day, it all clicks into place. You can't unlearn what you've just discovered. I don't think I need to tell you what happened next. I mean, it was just a couple of weeks ago, and I'm still trying to make sense of it all. But when you get an email like that, you don't just shrug it off. Not when you've been in these woods. Not when you know that sometimes the things out there in the country aren't exactly friendly. But maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about that night, about what I experienced, and maybe you'll understand why I'm not so sure anymore about the safety of these quiet country roads at night. I know what you're thinking. I sound crazy, right? But trust me, I wasn't imagining it. You don't just see something like that and forget about it. And the thing is, when you're living out here in the country, you get used to the silence. I mean, silence isn't just something that happens when everyone's asleep. It's a presence. It feels heavy. And when something disturbs that silence, you feel it in your bones. So after reading that email, I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept thinking about that tall figure standing in the dark. The kind of tall that doesn't belong in this world. The kind that seems to bend and stretch unnaturally, like it's made of shadow and fog rather than flesh and bone. But it wasn't until a few nights after I got the email that things really took a turn. I was back at my house, working late into the night. I had the porch light on, and the sound of crickets was louder than usual, as though they were trying to cover up something else that was moving in the distance. It wasn't just the usual sounds, no wind, no rustling of trees, just that oppressive quiet, like the air itself had stopped breathing. I was sitting in my living room, the TV on but muted, scrolling through some old photos when I heard it again. At first it was so faint I wasn't sure if it was just my imagination. The sound of something heavy dragging along the dirt slope, deliberate, not far from the back door. I froze. I've lived in this house for years, and I've heard my fair share of strange noises. Wild animals, wind moving through the trees, things scratching at the outside walls. But this was different. I glanced toward the window, and my heart nearly stopped. There, standing just past the porch, was something tall, too tall. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but there was no mistaking the outline. It was the same figure I had seen before, only this time it was closer, and it wasn't standing still. It was moving, slowly. I couldn't breathe. I stared, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But all I could think was that I needed to get out of the house. I grabbed my jacket, quietly crept toward the door, and eased it open just enough to slip outside without making a sound. The night air hit me like a cold slap to the face. It was wrong, like it wasn't supposed to be that cold this time of year. My skin crawled with the feeling of being watched, but I didn't dare look back. I had one goal: to get to the neighbor's house, just down the road. It was the closest safe place I could think of. As I walked, the dragging sound got louder. It wasn't behind me, but it was near. I tried to pick up the pace, but it felt like my feet were sinking into the ground with each step, as though something was pulling me back toward the woods. I wasn't sure how far I'd gone when I heard Ida's sharp, quick sound, like something hitting the ground. My heart pounded in my chest, and I glanced over my shoulder. The figure had followed me, just standing at the edge of the trees, like it was waiting for me to do something, to make a move. I didn't even think. I turned and ran. The next few minutes are a blur. I don't know how I made it to my neighbor's place, but I did. I knocked on their door, my heart racing, my breath shallow. They let me in, and I didn't stop to explain anything. I just sat there, eyes wide, trying to catch my breath, but there was no way to calm down. I spent the rest of the night at their place, and I didn't dare go back home until the sun was up. When I did finally go back to my house, everything seemed normal, too normal, but I knew better. I could feel the air around me still, like something had been disturbed and was now waiting, watching. And that's when I started piecing things together. There were other stories, scattered in the old family records, in hushed conversations with the locals, about things lurking in the woods, things that come out at night. I remembered my grandmother telling me stories about the old spirits that haunted these land spirits that didn't quite leave, not entirely. She'd warned me not to wander too far at night, not to stray from the road when the moon was high. But it wasn't just the spirits of the past she feared. There were other things out there, things that didn't belong in this world. And I think that thing, whatever it was, had been following me for longer than I realized. I didn't think much about it at first. I mean, we all have those nights when we hear something strange or see something out of the corner of our eye. But as the days went on, the events started to pile up. The figure wasn't just a once-off encounter, it kept happening. Every few nights, it would appear again, closer, as if it were getting bolder. But the worst part was when I realized that it wasn't just the figure I had to worry about. It was the sound, the dragging, because it didn't just happen when the figure was there. No, it started happening even when I was inside, alone, in the safety of my own home. Something was out there, something that wasn't content with just being a shadow in the night. The nights grew longer, and the air colder. The dragging sound, it didn't stop. It became part of my life, like some twisted soundtrack that I couldn't escape. It wasn't like normal noises. It was deliberate, slow, like something or someone was pacing the ground just outside the walls of my house. Sometimes it was close enough that I could hear the faint scrape of metal or rock against the earth. Other times, it was faint, distant, almost as though it were just beyond the tree line. But it didn't matter how far away it seemed. The truth was, it was always there, always watching. and I could never get a full night of sleep. I tried everything. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that the isolation was getting to me. I even set up cameras around the house, hoping to capture some kind of rational explanation. Maybe a raccoon with an odd habit? Maybe the wind had knocked something over? But every time I checked the footage, the cameras showed nothing. Nothing at all. And then, it happened again. One night, the sound came again closer than ever before. I was wide awake, lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling. The house was completely still. I hadn't heard anything for hours, and for a brief moment, I dared to believe that maybe it had stopped, that maybe it was all in my head. But then, that scraping sound drag came from the back of the house. Slow, steady, like it was deliberately circling the property. My heart pounded in my chest. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that it was probably just a deer, but I knew better. I knew it wasn't an animal. I got up, grabbed the flashlight, and stood by the window, waiting, trying to peer through the dark. My hands shook as I held the beam of light against the glass, hoping to catch sight of something, anything. And then I saw it. There in the distance, just past the edge of the woods, I saw the silhouette of the figure. It was waiting. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at it. Time seemed to stretch, every second feeling like an eternity. And then the figure moved. Slowly, unnervingly slow. It glided forward, dragging something behind it. The dragging sound grew louder, like it was coming closer, right to the back door. I turned to the door, my heart hammering. I couldn't breathe. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The thing was at my doorstep, and the only thing separating me from it was a thin door and a lock that felt completely useless in that moment. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The figure had gone. I don't know how long I waited, standing there in the dark, but after what felt like hours, I finally moved. I didn't want to God. I didn't, but I had to see. I had to know. I opened the door just a crack, peering out into the night, my flashlight trembling in my hand. There was nothing there, just the darkness. But then I looked down. The ground around the back step was disturbed. It wasn't much, just a few deep, fresh marks in the dirt, as though something heavy had been dragged across the ground. And there, right at the edge, were deep gouges, almost like claw marks, but too wide, too rough to be anything natural. I closed the door and bolted it shut, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I knew at that moment, whatever it wasn't just a passing shadow. It wasn't just some animal or figment of my imagination. It was something real, and it was getting closer. I stayed up the rest of the night, peeking through the blinds, flashlight always in hand, waiting for the next sign, the next thing to appear. When the morning came, I thought maybe it was just a bad dream. But then I checked the footage from the security cameras. The footage was completely wiped. Not a single frame recorded, just static. I checked the logs too. The cameras had been powered off, completely turned off. Someone had tampered with them, and that meant it was no longer just a strange occurrence. It was personal. The next few days, I stayed at a friend's house in town. I didn't care how ridiculous it seemed. I couldn't go back there, not yet. I tried to think rationally, tried to convince myself that maybe I was just going insane, that the isolation was getting to me. But deep down, I knew something else was out there, something that wasn't interested in being rational. And then, the emails started coming. More and more of them, all from different people, all telling stories about strange things happening to them out in the country at night. Some of them talked about figures in the distance, like the one I had seen. Others mentioned strange noises, dragging sounds, just like the ones I had heard. Some spoke of things that moved just outside their windows, things that watched them but never came closer than a few feet. One email stood out to me. It was short, to the point. "You're not alone. It's been following me for years. It gets closer every time." I knew then that this wasn't just some local legend. This wasn't something my mind had conjured up in the dark. This thing, whatever it was, had been watching me for longer than I could imagine. But why? Why had it chosen me? Why now? I didn't have the answers. But I knew one thing. It wasn't going to stop, and I wasn't going to be the one to find out what happened when it finally did. The next few days were a blur. I stayed with my friend in town, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the feeling of being watched, no, it was deeper than that. It was a presence, something far more sinister than I could have ever imagined. I kept seeing flashes in my mind. The figure standing just beyond the tree line, the scraping sound that seemed to follow me wherever I went, and the deep gouges on the ground outside my house. I tried to distract myself, to stay occupied, but I couldn't escape it. Even when I was in town, I felt as though something was waiting for me back at my house, out in those woods. It was like it had marked me, like it knew I was trying to run from it. The only thing that gave me any relief, even for a moment, was being around people who didn't seem to feel the same oppressive weight hanging over them. But sooner or later, I knew I'd have to go back. My house wasn't just a house, it was my home. And whatever was out there, whatever had been following me, couldn't drive me out of my own life. I tried to convince myself that I was being paranoid, that maybe it really was all in my head. After all, the figure had never truly hurt me, had it? I couldn't lie to myself anymore. A week passed, and I finally made the decision to return. My nerves were shot, and as I packed up to go back to my place, I felt that same gnawing dread that had been with me since the first night. But I had to face it. I had to know. When I pulled into my driveway, everything seemed oddly normal. The house stood silent, untouched by the dark, oppressive air I had been dreading. For a moment, I almost thought maybe everything had been in my head, that I had exaggerated things in my mind. Maybe I'd let the isolation play tricks on me. But as I stood there in the yard, the weight returned. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, my pulse quickened, and the silence grew heavier. I forced myself to step inside. The house was cold, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones even with the heater running. I didn't turn on the lights immediately. I didn't want to feel like I was giving in to fear. I thought about checking the cameras, but then I remembered that they hadn't worked the last time. I made my way to the kitchen, trying to shake the feeling that someone or something was just around the corner. The quiet was unbearable, like the house was holding its breath. I tried to calm myself, put the kettle on for some tea, but as I poured the hot water into the cup, a sound stopped me dead in my tracks. It was that dragging noise, slow, methodical, closer than it had ever been. I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't think. I slowly turned toward the back door. The sound wasn't just outside, it was coming from the hallway, closer, like it was coming from within the house. My heart started pounding in my chest as I inched toward the source of the noise. The kitchen light flickered, casting odd shadows on the walls. My mind raced. I checked the back door locked. I checked the window sealed. Everything was as it should be. But the dragging continued, slow and deliberate, like it was circling, like it was testing the perimeter. I went to the back window, barely daring to pull the curtain aside, and there it was just beyond the tree line. But this time, it was closer. It wasn't just standing still like before. No, now it was moving, walking in a circle around my house, dragging something behind it. The shape was unmistakable, tall, unnaturally tall. I knew then, without a doubt, that it wasn't a person. It wasn't something of this world, and it was closer than ever before. I ran to the front door, locking it in a panic, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the window. The thing moved closer, its pace unnervingly steady. My breath caught in my throat when I realized it was now standing directly outside my front porch, just beyond the porch light. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its presence, heavy, suffocating. I backed away from the window, my heart racing. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay there, not with that thing outside, not with it so close. But the house? It was my only place of safety. I needed to leave. But the thought of leaving meant turning my back on the thing that had been watching me for so long. I was trapped. I grabbed my phone and dialed my friend's number, but the call failed. I tried again. Nothing. I checked my service gone. No bars, no signal. It was as though the whole world had gone silent, as if the house itself was trying to isolate me from any escape. The dragging sound stopped. I stood there in the dead silence, my breathing shallow, as my eyes frantically searched for any sign of movement. But the thing, whatever it was gone. I waited in that silence for what felt like hours, just watching, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. Eventually, the sun began to rise, its light spilling across the floor, and the oppressive weight seemed to lift, if only a little. I left my house again that morning, not even bothering to check the footage from the security cameras. At that point, I already knew the answer. This thing, this presence, had made it clear. It was here to stay. It wasn't just in my head, and it wasn't leaving, not without a fight. And as the days passed, I began to notice something else. The emails started flooding in again. And this time, the messages weren't just from strangers, they were from people who had lived in this area for years. People I had known, people I had trusted. They spoke of the same figure, the same dragging sounds. They spoke of strange occurrences, of things that moved in the shadows of the woods, and each one said the same thing: it's not over. At that moment, I realized this wasn't just my story anymore. It wasn't just my haunting. It was ours. The days turned into weeks, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The emails kept coming in, each one a terrifying reminder that I wasn't alone in this. People who had never met me, people who had no idea what had been happening in my house, described the same things I'd seen. The figure, the dragging noise, the strange, oppressive silence that seemed to hang in the air, just beyond the reach of human understanding. But there was one message that stood out from the rest. It came late one evening, just after sunset. The sender's name was unfamiliar, but the subject line chilled me to the bone. "It knows what you did." I opened the email cautiously, as if the words themselves could leap off the screen and grab me. It read, "You think it's just a shadow. You think it's just something from your nightmares. But you're wrong. It's been watching for much longer than you realize. You've heard its name before, but you've forgotten. The figure, the one you've seen in your yard, it's not just a wandering spirit. It's something far worse. Something that was bound to this land long before your family came here. And if you think it's just going to leave, you're dead wrong. It's waiting for you to remember. It's waiting for you to understand. And when you do, it's going to come for you in a way you won't be able to escape." The email was unsigned, but it didn't matter. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and the fear that had been building inside me for weeks suddenly boiled over. I had to know. I had to understand what was happening to me. So I did what I should have done from the start. I went to the local library. The Old Town Library had always been a place of comfort for me, even as a kid. There was something about the smell of old books, the creaky wooden shelves, that made me feel like I was stepping into another world. But now, it felt different, darker, as if the very walls were closing in around me. I went straight to the archives section, where they kept records of the town's history. The old records, the ones that no one ever seemed to want to talk about. As I searched through dusty boxes of papers, I came across an old journal, a journal that looked far older than anything else in that room. Its leather cover was cracked, the pages yellowed with age. The handwriting inside was elegant, but shaky, as though the writer was struggling to keep their thoughts clear. I turned the pages, feeling the weight of history pressing down on me with each one. And then I found it, a name. The same name I had seen in that email, the Thing of the Hollow. The journal was filled with details about strange occurrences, things that sounded too much like my own experiences to be coincidental. The author spoke of a figure that appeared only at night, a tall, shadowy form that would drag something heavy behind it. People in the area had reported seeing it for generations. But the most disturbing part of the journal was a description of what it wasn't, more importantly, why it was there. The thing wasn't just a spirit. It wasn't a ghost or a lost soul. It was a creature, bound to the land, tied to it by an ancient curse. The journal spoke of a ritual, something done long ago by the town's founders, something that had gone horribly wrong. The curse had been meant to protect the land, but instead, it had created a being that fed on fear, a thing that grew stronger the more fear it could harvest. I sat there in stunned silence, reading the words over and over. It was all starting to make sense. The figure I had seen, the dragging sound, it wasn't just a random haunting. It was part of something much larger, something that had been here long before I ever set foot on this land. I couldn't stop reading, even as a sense of dread settled over me. The journal went on to describe the horrifying end of the curse, the one that had come with the last ritual, a ritual that was supposed to break the curse but instead solidified it. The author wrote about how, when the curse had been completed, the creature's power had grown, its hunger had become insatiable, and worst of all, the last line in the journal said something that I couldn't ignore. If you are reading this, then it has already begun again. The weight of the words pressed down on me, suffocating me. It had never stopped. The curse, the thing, it had been waiting for me. Waiting for someone like me to stumble upon the truth, to unknowingly open the door once more. And now that I had found it, now that I knew what was going on, it was coming. For me, I slammed the journal shut, my mind racing. I had to get out of there, had to leave town, leave the house behind. But the moment I stood up to leave, a cold wind swept through the room, sending chills down my spine. The air felt thick, heavy, as though the very fabric of reality was about to tear apart. I turned toward the door, but before I could take a step, I heard the dragging noise. It was faint at first, distant, but it grew louder with each passing second, as if something was walking closer to me. I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the empty library, the shelves of books, and the creeping sensation that I wasn't alone. The doors slammed shut behind me, locking me in place. I was trapped. And then I heard it again, the dragging sound, much closer now, and the unmistakable sound of something breathing heavily in the dark. I couldn't see it, but I felt it, right there in the room with me. The thing wasn't just outside. It had followed me in. It knew I was close to understanding. And now that I knew, now that I had remembered, there was no escaping it. The room grew colder, the darkness pressing in tighter, and the air felt thick with the weight of centuries. I was no longer just a victim of the curse, I was a part of it. And in that moment, I realized something that chilled me to my core. I wasn't meant to survive this. I wasn't meant to break free. I was meant to be the final sacrifice. The dragging stopped, then silence. And in the silence, I heard the voice that came from the darkness, the voice that had been waiting. It was time. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. I've got something unsettling to share with you tonight. This story isn't mine originally. It came from an email sent by one of our listeners. When I first read it, I dismissed it as another tall tale, the kind of creepy folklore you hear in small towns. But after what happened to me last week, I can't ignore it anymore. The email came with the subject line, "Don't look in the fields at night." I'll read the first part of it to you, then tell you what happened when I didn't listen. I don't know if this is the right place to send this, but you need to hear it. There's something out in the fields where I live. It's not an animal, and it's not human. I've seen it. And if you're not careful, you'll see it too. Don't go outside after dark. Don't look too long at the fields. And whatever you do, don't acknowledge it. If it knows you've seen it, it will follow you home. That's how it started. Pretty standard urban legend stuff, right? But the email went on to describe things in such vivid detail that it was hard to ignore. The writer said they lived in a small house surrounded by cornfields and had started noticing strange things, a low, rhythmic tapping on their windows at night, footprints in the soft dirt around their home even though no one had been there. And then there were the light spale, flickering lights that hovered just above the stalks, like will-o'-the-wisps. It sounded like something out of a campfire story, but I have to admit, it got under my skin. Especially because my own house isn't so different. I'm out here in the countryside too, surrounded by open fields and dense woods. So I filed the email away and tried not to think about it. That was until last Thursday. Last Thursday, I was finishing up late. The sun had set hours ago, and the house was quiet except for the faint hum of my laptop. I had just wrapped up editing a video when I noticed something strange. The room felt colder. Not the normal kind of chill that creeps in during the night, but a biting cold, like the air itself was being sucked out. I shrugged it off and closed my laptop, but as I did, I heard a faint sound outside. Tap, tap, tap. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and coming from the window in the next room. Now, living out here, you get used to noises at night. Animals rustling in the bushes, branches scraping against the house when the wind picks up. But this was different. It wasn't random, and it wasn't faint like a tree branch. It sounded like someone or something tapping on the glass with a single deliberate finger. I told myself it was nothing. I stayed put, staring at my reflection in the dark screen of my laptop, trying to ignore the sound. But it didn't stop. It grew louder. Tap, tap, tap. I finally got up, heart pounding, and walked to the window. The room was dark, but moonlight spilled through the curtains, casting long, faint shadows. I didn't want to pull them back. Every instinct told me not to, but curiosity got the better of me. I reached out and gently parted the fabric, just enough to peek through. There was nothing. The field beyond my yard stretched out in the moonlight, tall stalks swaying gently in the breeze. I let out a shaky breath and stepped back. But as I turned to leave the room, I saw it. A light, faint and flickering, just above the field. It wasn't a fire, and it wasn't from a house or barn in the distance. It moved erratically, like something alive. And then, it wasn't just one light, there were several, appearing one by one in the distance. I stood there, frozen. The lights didn't move closer, but they didn't disappear either. They hovered, pulsing faintly, like they were watching. I thought about the email. Don't acknowledge it. If it knows you've seen it, it will follow you home. I backed away slowly, trying not to make a sound, and returned to my room. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe swamp gas or fireflies playing tricks on me. But the email nagged at the back of my mind, like a warning I couldn't shake. That day, I went outside to check the yard. I wasn't expecting to find anything, but then I saw them footprints. They were large, larger than any humans, pressed deep into the soil around my house. The weird thing was, they didn't look quite right. The shape was wrong too long, with what looked like claw marks at the tips, and they didn't lead to or from the house. They just circled it. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but when night fell, the unease crept back in. I tried to go about my evening as usual, but as the clock ticked past midnight, I felt it again, that biting cold, the kind that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. And then, the tapping started again. When we left off, the tapping had started again. I'll admit I was terrified, but there's something about fear it makes you want to confront it, to prove to yourself that it's not as bad as you think. So, despite everything, I decided to look. The tapping wasn't coming from the same window as before. This time, it was from the back of the house, the one that looked out over the field. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the kitchen, where the sound was steady and insistent. Tap, tap, tap. It was louder now, more deliberate. My hand hovered over the curtain for a long time. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to walk away, to turn off the lights, and pretend I hadn't heard anything. But I didn't. I pulled the curtain aside, flashlight in hand, and aimed the beam out into the darkness. What I saw still haunts me. The field looked the same as always, a sea of swaying stalks under the moonlight. But right at the edge of my yard, just beyond the reach of the flashlight's beam, was something wrong. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body thin and angular like a tree stripped of its bark. Its arms hung low, almost dragging on the ground, and its head was tilted to one side, as if it didn't quite understand what it was looking at. And then it moved. The creature stepped closer, and as it did, I realized something horrifying. It wasn't just tail, it was unnaturally elongated, its limbs bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The flashlight's beam caught its face, and my stomach turned. It didn't have eyes, or at least not eyes like ours. Instead, there were two hollow sockets, deep and empty, that seemed to absorb the light. Its mouth was wide, too wide, stretching across its face in a grin that didn't feel human. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I backed away from the window, my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped the flashlight. And then it spoke. Its voice was low and guttural, like the rumble of distant thunder. It didn't say words, not exactly, but I understood what it meant. It was inviting me outside. The tapping started again, louder now, and I realized it wasn't coming from the window anymore. It was coming from the walls. I ran to my room, slammed the door, and locked it. The tapping followed me, echoing through the house. I could feel the vibrations in the floorboards, in the walls, like the whole house was alive. I crouched by the bed, clutching the flashlight like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. And then, the lights appeared again. Through the window, I could see them floating in the field, closer than they had been the night before. They moved erratically, darting and weaving through the stalks, and I realized with a sickening certainty that they were looking for something. Looking for me. The email flashed through my mind again. If it knows you've seen it, it will follow you home. I had seen it. I had looked directly at it, and now it knew. The tapping stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was worse. It was so complete, so heavy, that it felt like the world had gone dead. And then, from somewhere deep within the house, I heard it. The creak of a floorboard. It was inside. I don't know how long I stayed there, frozen in place, listening to the sound of its footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and heavy, like whatever was walking was dragging something behind it. The steps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside my door. And then, a voice. This time, it was clearer, human almost. It said my name. I don't remember much of what happened after that. At some point, I must have passed out, because when I opened my eyes, it was morning. The house was quiet again, and the sunlight streaming through the windows made everything feel normal. But it wasn't normal. The footprints were back, circling the house like before, but now there were more of them, dozens. And they didn't just stay in the yard, they led up to the windows, to the doors, like something or many somethings had been trying to get in. And then I noticed the marks on the walls. Long, jagged scratches, deep enough to gouge the wood. The email's warning was clear. Don't acknowledge it. Don't let it know you've seen it. But I had broken the rules, and now, whatever it wasn't going to leave me alone. That night, the lights returned. But this time, they weren't just in the field. They were in my yard. If you've been following along, you know the situation has gone from bad to worse. By this point, I was convinced that whatever had been stalking me wasn't going to stop. It had crossed the line between haunting and hunting. The email's warning felt like an anchor in my mind, but I'd already broken the rules. I decided I couldn't stay in the house anymore. Whatever it was, it had gotten in. I packed a bag that morning with essentials, clothes, my laptop, and my flashlight. By mid-afternoon, I was on the road, heading toward the nearest motel. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Honestly, I didn't think anyone would believe me if I tried to explain what was happening. The drive was uneventful at first. The countryside stretched out in all directions, fields giving way to woods, then back to fields again. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something lurking in the distance, but the road behind me stayed empty. For a while, I let myself believe I'd outrun it. But as the sun began to set, the unease returned. It started with the lights. I was about halfway to the motel when I noticed them in the distance, hovering over the fields like tiny, flickering lanterns. At first, they were faint, far enough away that I could convince myself they were just fireflies or reflections. But as the road wound closer to the fields, the lights followed. I sped up, my heart pounding in my chest. The lights didn't fade. They kept pace with me, moving alongside the car in the fields. And then I realized something chilling. They weren't just floating. They were keeping a steady rhythm, like they were walking. I tried to ignore them, focusing on the road ahead, but my headlights caught something that made my stomach drop. A figure. It was standing in the middle of the road, tall and thin, its head tilted to the side just like before. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt just a few feet away from it. But when I blinked, it was gone. The road was empty again, the fields quiet, except for the flickering lights. I sat there, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. And then I heard the tapping. It wasn't coming from outside this time. The sound was faint at first, like a soft knock on the window, but it grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the back seat. I didn't look. I couldn't. My breath hitched, and my hands shook as I reached for the gear shift. I slammed the car into drive and hit the gas, the tapping growing frantic as I sped down the road. The lights in the fields kept pace with me, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw shadows moving through the stock shapes that were too tall, too thin to be human. I don't know how I made it to the motel without crashing. When I finally pulled into the parking lot, I didn't even bother grabbing my bag. I bolted from the car and ran inside, slamming the door behind me. The room was small and cheap, but it felt safe, at least for a little while. I drew the curtains tight and turned on every light, hoping the brightness would keep whatever it was at bay. But as the hours dragged on, the sense of safety began to fade. Around midnight, the lights flickered. Just once, at first, but then again and again. And then the tapping returned. This time, it was on the window of the motel room. I didn't want to look. I knew what I'd see, but something compelled me, some deep, horrible curiosity that I couldn't ignore. I inched toward the window, heart hammering in my chest, and pulled back the curtain just enough to peek outside. The lights were there, closer than ever, hovering just beyond the parking lot, and in the center of them was the figure. It stood perfectly still, its head tilted to the side, those hollow sockets staring straight at me. I let the curtain drop and stumbled back, my mind racing. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't outrun it. And then I remembered the journal. The journal from the town library had mentioned a ritual, something the town's founders had done to bind the thing to the land. But it had also mentioned something else way to stop it. I hadn't paid much attention to that part before. At the time, it had seemed like just another piece of folklore, but now, it felt like my only option. The ritual required 3 things: fire, salt, and blood. The fire was supposed to purify the land, the salt to ward off evil, and the blood, well, I didn't want to think about what the blood was for, but I didn't have a choice. I grabbed the bag I'd packed earlier and drove back toward the house. By now, I'd decided to face whatever this thing was head on. I had no idea if the ritual would work, but it was better than waiting for it to catch me. I got back to the house just after midnight. The air was heavy, the kind of stillness that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. The fields surrounding the house looked endless, dark and foreboding, the tops of the stalks swaying even though there was no wind. The lights were there too, scattered across the field like sentinels flickering faintly. I didn't look at them for long. The journal's instructions were simple, but ominous. I needed to create a circle of fire and salt in the yard, then offer something personal as a symbol of blood. According to the text, the ritual would either banish the entity or, well, it didn't say what would happen if it didn't work. I started by spreading a thick line of salt in a circle around me. My hands trembled as I worked, the granules spilling unevenly in the moonlight. Every now and then, I'd glance up at the fields, half expecting to see the figure standing there, watching me. Once the circle was complete, I poured lighter fluid over a pile of kindling I'd gathered earlier in the day and lit it. The fire roared to life, casting flickering shadows across the yard. The lights in the field stopped moving. They hovered, frozen in place, as if watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I forced myself to focus. The final step was the blood. I hesitated, staring at the small knife I'd brought with me. The idea of cutting myself felt absurd, like something out of a horror movie, but I didn't have time to second-guess myself. I made a small cut on the palm of my hand, wincing as the blade bit into my skin. Blood welled up immediately, dark and glossy in the firelight. I let it drip onto the ground at the center of the circle, muttering the words from the journal under my breath. At first, nothing happened. The silence stretched on, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the pounding of my heart. I started to think I'd made a mistake, that the ritual was just a piece of folklore with no real power. And then I felt it. The air changed. It grew heavier, colder, like a weight pressing down on my chest. The fire flickered violently, the flames bending toward the fields, as if drawn by an invisible force. And then I saw it. The figure stepped out of the shadows, its elongated limbs moving unnaturally, like a puppet on tangled strings. Its head tilted, those hollow sockets locked onto me, and its mouth stretched into that impossibly wide grin. The lights in the field moved closer, circling the house like a swarm of fireflies. The figure didn't move into the circle, but I could feel its presence pressing against the barrier of salt and fire, testing it. I kept repeating the words from the journal, my voice shaking but steady. The figure tilted its head the other way, as if listening, and then it let out a sound, a low, guttural noise that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite human. The lights grew brighter, the air colder, and for a moment, I thought the circle would break. But then the fire flared, burning impossibly bright, and the figure recoiled. The lights flickered violently, and the figure let out a screech that made my ears ring. It stumbled back, its movements jerky and unnatural, before vanishing into the darkness. The lights in the field dimmed, one by one, until the only illumination came from the fire at my feet. And then silence. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in the circle until dawn, the fire burning low but steady. When the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, I finally allowed myself to step out. The yard was quiet. The fields were empty. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. But here's the thing. The journal didn't say the ritual would destroy the entity, only that it would banish it. And as I packed my things and left the house for good, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Sometimes, at night, I still hear the tapping. And when I look out into the darkness, I swear I can see the faint flicker of lights hovering just beyond the trees. That's the end of my story for now. If you've ever experienced something similar, you know how hard it is to let go of the fear